On this 200th anniversary of the founding of our republic, I invite us to look to the future. The future of the republic is, of course, the next generation, the children alive today or to be born in the years to come. What will our children become? What does the future hold for them? There are, of course, many forces that shape child into adult, but at least at the beginning, almost all of them arise from or are mediated by the institution that bears primary responsibility, especially in our society, for the care and quality of the next generation, the family. We therefore do well to begin our inquiry by looking at families in the United States. What has been happening to the family in recent decades, and what is likely to happen, at least in the immediate future? The answer to that question is rather clear. The American family has been falling apart. Evidence? Recently, I completed an extensive analysis of all the data available from the United States Census bearing on changes in the American family from World War II up to the present. What these data reveal is progressive fragmentation, breaking up, and isolation of the family in its child-rearing role. To begin with a familiar fact, every year more and more mothers are going to work. Now, over half of those with school-age children, over 1/3 with children under 6, and even for mothers of children under 3, the figure is 1/3. And regardless of the age of the child, 2/3 of all these working mothers are working full-time. Now, there's a second change that accompanies the first. As more mothers go to work, the number of adults left in the home who might care for a child has been decreasing in two ways. First, there's what the sociologists call the extended family. That's the family with all the relatives, grandpa and uncles and aunts and so on. That kind of family has been shrinking, indeed, disappearing. But shrinkage and disappearance have been even more pronounced in the so-called nuclear family, consisting of mother, father, and children. For today, more than 1 in every 6 children in the United States is living in a single-parent family, and that one parent is generally also the head of the family, which means holding down a job, and usually a full-time job. Moreover, this is often not a temporary state, because the remarriage rate, especially for women with children, is substantially lower than the rate of divorce in families involving children. And this gap, this differential, is increasing over time. So there is not replacement. A second significant component in the growth of single-parent families has been a sharp rise in the number of unwed mothers. More young women are postponing the age of marriage, but some of them are having children nevertheless. Now, all of these changes are occurring most rapidly among younger families with small children. So it's the new thing to do. But they also increase with a degree of economic deprivation and urbanization, reaching their maximum among low-income families living in the central core of our largest cities. And here we come to a statistic that I don't believe every time I check it out, but it remains the same. In low-income areas of central cities across the United States, in terms of the census data, the percentage in such areas of single-parent families runs 80%. In these low-income central cities, 80% of all the families are single-parent families. Now, although levels of labor force participation in single parenthood and these other related factors are substantially higher for non-whites than for whites in our country, those families residing in similar economic and social settings show similar rates of change. In other words, the critical factor is not race, it's the conditions under which the family lives. But I want to stress that the general trend is not limited to the poor or to the big cities. It applies to all strata of the society. Middle-class families in cities, in suburbia, and rural areas are changing in similar ways. Specifically, in terms of such characteristics as the proportion of working mothers, the number of adults in the home, single parents, children born out of wedlock, and so on, the middle-class family of today now resembles the low-income family of the early 1960s. We've arrived. So what? Maybe it's all for the best. At least now, a woman is no longer excluded from the job market, limited for a lifetime to the role of wife and mother, caring for, feeding, cleaning house, not only for children and husband, but a raft of relatives as well. At least they're gone. Nor are a mismatched couple any longer bound to live out their lives in prison in a loveless marriage that should not have been consummated in the first place. What's more, a woman is now free to get a baby without having to put up with a husband in the bargain. Are not these new and more honest family forms? Perhaps so. But one cannot help wondering why honesty and innovation should be so heavily concentrated among the poor. Poor but honest, we say. In this case, honest but poor. But remember, it's happening to the non-poor as well, and what does that mean? What does it mean for children in general that more and more mothers, especially mothers of preschoolers and infants, are going to work, the majority of them full-time? What does it mean that as these mothers leave for work, there are also fewer adults in the family who might look after the child, and that in ever more families there's only one parent who is usually also the breadwinner and working full-time? Paradoxically, the most telling answer to that question is yet another question. Who cares for America's children? Who cares? At the present, as you know, substitute care for children, care of whatever form, nursery schools, group daycare, family daycare, or just a body to babysit, falls far short of the need. Now, in speaking of need, I have in mind not subjective feelings, but an objective situation in which there is no competent, responsible person available to care for the child. Now, that kind of objective need can be measured in millions of children under the age of 6, not to mention the millions more of school-age youngsters, so-called latchkey children, who come home to empty houses and who contribute far out of proportion to the ranks of pupils with academic and behavior problems, who have difficulties in learning to read, who are dropouts, drug users, delinquents. But we're getting ahead of a story. Unfortunately, statistics at a national level on the state of the child are neither as comprehensive nor as complete as those on the state of the family. In our census data, it is the taxpayer who counts and gets counted. There's lots of information about adults, much less about children. Nevertheless, the available data do suggest a pattern that strikingly parallels the trend observed for changes in the family. Specifically, going along with shifts in the structure and position of the family are changes in indices reflecting the impaired well-being and development of children. Youngsters growing up in low-income families are, as we know, at especially high risk of damage, physically, intellectually, emotionally, and socially. But the evidence also reveals disturbing changes over time, indicated by declining levels of academic performance and rising rates of child homicide, that's the killing of children, and there are two age groups that are show a particularly strong rise. One is teenagers, which familiar. The other is the other age group, infants in the first year of life. Suicide rates for the young, drug use, and juvenile delinquency. The most recent estimates are that soon 1 out of every 9 children in the United States will have appeared before a juvenile court. That doesn't count all those who never get there. Now, ironically, many of these trends find their strongest expression in the institutions of society bearing primary responsibility for the preparation of children and youth for participation in the world, namely the nation's schools. For example, a recent report of the Committee of the Judiciary of the United States Senate, the title really tells the story, Our Nation's Schools, a Report Card, A in School Violence and Vandalism. That's the title of the report. The report emphasizes that the pattern is not restricted to big cities and slums. As the title implies, it is a national phenomenon. School vandalism is now as American as apple pie. No school system is complete without a security force. The handwriting is literally on the wall. Now, the fact that the signs of progressive disarray are not limited to the poor and the non-white is most clearly apparent from data on academic achievement among the college-bound. You may already be familiar with a phenomenon widely reported in the press, the steady decline over the past dozen years in average performance on the SAT, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, which is taken by the overwhelming majority of high school students who plan to go to college. Now, since 1963, there has been a decline of 25 points in the mathematics score and 44 points in the verbal score. What you may not be familiar with is a recent comprehensive study sponsored by the Ford Foundation reveals that the decline in academic achievement is manifested among pupils from all segments of the society, not just those going to college. The researchers analyzed time trends and data from the 7 major national testing programs with an effort to take into account possible confounding influences resulting from changes in the test, from changes in the pupil populations and other sources, and their conclusions are stated as follows. Beyond doubt, beyond differences among assessment instruments, alterations in tests, changes in pupil composition, and then the part in italics, achievement test scores have been declining for about a decade in all grades from 5 upwards. Goes on with some details, ending up with, we found lower test scores in English, writing, literature, vocabulary, reading, social studies, mathematics, natural sciences, and so on, every area. In speculating about the possible causes of the decline, the authors point to the possible distracting influence of television, but I would call to your attention a statement by the chief analyst for the College Entrance Examination Board that administers the SATs. The SAT measures skills developed over a youngster's lifetime, both in and out of the school setting. It is evident that many factors, including family and home life, and other cultural and environmental factors are associated with students' performance. Nor is the deficiency limited to test conducted by the U.S. Office of Education, of skills required for everyday living. I won't enter into all of them here. Well, I'll mention one that happens to hit me. They examined a population of 40 million, and about 13%, amounting to 15 million, were unable to address an envelope well enough to assure that the Postal Service could deliver it. I'm one of those. And 14%, equivalent to 16.5 million, were unable to make out a personal check correctly enough for a bank to process it. Now, how are we to explain these changes over time for American families and children? Is the progressive breakup and isolation of the family producing the decline in the intellectual and social competence of children and adults, or are both the products of prior and deeper forces of disruption in our society? The data, of course, themselves do not permit an answer to that question. We shall have to seek for explanations elsewhere. And in order to do so, I ask you to make an assumption about what the data I have presented to you mean. And the assumption I'm asking you to make is that they mean trouble. Trouble for children, trouble for those responsible for their care and education. Now, if you're willing to make that assumption, then we're in a position to put a more important question. What can we do about it? What can we do to avert, or even to reduce a little, the disarray that is growing in the lives of America's children and families? What should our strategy be? Should we concentrate our energies on getting more daycare? Should we seek legislation to provide families with a guaranteed minimal annual income? Should we introduce special education programs for young children or their parents? All of these? None of these? The answer depends on what you think the problem is. And at this point, we pass from fact to interpretation, and I give you warning. Beware of interpretations and those who make them. And I shall now proceed to make interpretations of evidence bearing on 4 questions. First, what do the facts say about what the needs of children are? Second, what do the data say about how well these needs are being met in our country at this point in our history? Third, what do the data say about the conditions that determine how well needs are met? And finally, what do the data say about how we can improve these conditions? Now, The difficulty, of course, is that scientific findings bearing on these questions are incomplete, but I intend to tell you what information we have so that you may do something about it. So onward to data, interpretation, and don't forget, skepticism. What do the research data say about the needs of young children? Here's what they say to me. In order to develop physiologically, mentally, emotionally, motivationally, socially, and morally, got that? A child requires, for all of them, the same thing. Proposition 1. In order to develop in all those ways, a child needs the enduring, irrational involvement of one or more adults in care and joint activity with that child. Question. What do I mean by irrational involvement? Answer. Somebody's got to be crazy about that kid. What do I mean by care? I mean by care what you mean by care. Providing shelter, food, clothing, health services, protecting the child from harm, easing pain, physical, psychological. What do I mean by joint activity? That's a little more complicated. It brings us to Proposition 2. Proposition 2. The psychological development of the child is brought about through his continuing involvement, watch the gobbledygook now, in progressively more complex patterns of reciprocal activity, ping-pong game, with persons with whom the child develops a strong and enduring mutual emotional attachment. That part at the end, that's that irrational part. So now let's analyze it rationally. What do we mean by a strong and enduring mutual attachment? I mean a love affair that doesn't break up and that lasts a long, long time. How long? An acquaintance asked me the other day, Professor, at what age of the child should a parent stop acting and feeling like a parent and just be a friend? Now, when you're confronted with a question like that, you can only react with the oldest academic parry there is. Plato's ploy, I called it, because that great questioner used it so well. With all the earnestness I could muster, I responded, "What do you think?" Answer. I guess when a child graduates from high school, but now I get the idea that you psychologists think it ought to be a lot sooner. Interesting. But back to business. Why an irrational involvement? Answer from a Soviet colleague. You can't pay a woman to do what a mother will do for free. Woman, mother. As you probably know, communist propaganda about sexual equality notwithstanding, so far as women's liberation is concerned, the Soviet Union has a long way to go. Incidentally, so does China, and not so incidentally, so do we. But more of that later. We were talking about enduring, irrational involvement, love that lasts. But as Bruno Bettelheim has emphasized in the text and indeed the title of one of his books, love is not enough. Notice that my Soviet colleague did not say love. He said do. You can't pay a woman to do what a mother will do for free. Love must involve action, specifically care, and, of course, progressively more complex activity that our old business. In fact, Proposition 2 implies not that love generates care, but the reverse. It is after the child engages in intensive reciprocal activity with someone that the two of them then develop a strong and enduring emotional attachment. And that brings us to Proposition 3. The involvement of caretaker and child in patterns of progressively more complex reciprocal activity generates something. It generates, as we've already seen, an emotional bond, enhanced motivation, and cognitive and manipulatory skills. The emotional bond, that's the heart. Cognitive skills, that's the head. And manipulatory skills, that's the hand. Skills that are mutually reinforcing to both participants. You get hooked by them and are then reflected in the child's competence and cooperation in other situations, thereby facilitating the child's development. In short, the human development can be thought of as the momentum from that ping pong game between two people who are crazy about each other. Everything else you learn in school because of that game. You competent in the job because of that game. That's where it started. That's where you learned. So we've been examining answers to our first question. What do the research data say about a child's needs? Now, we're by no means done. For each answer poses new questions. For example, what's the nature of these activities? What exactly does one do? And who's to do it? Mothers, fathers, daycare workers, babysitters, the government? Now, paradoxically, these secondary queries can't be answered until we consider the remaining three of our primary issues. So let's turn to the second major question. How effectively are the child's needs being met today? Answer, not very. In fact, less and less effectively each year, in my judgment. In my judgment, each year there is less and less joint activity, therefore less care, therefore less emotional involvement. Do I mean that parents do not love their children as much? I guess so, but there's really no direct evidence on that. And by now, you should be really uneasy. You should be asking, what's his evidence? Where'd you get all that? What's his evidence? Answer, not very good. In fact, you've heard most of it already. It was in all those statistics I began with. How did I get here from there? Well, you remember what the child needs: enduring reciprocal joint activity in progressively more complex situations, generating and so on. Now, joint activity requires an occasion. Progressively more complex joint activity requires not just one occasion, it requires time. And if it's joint activity, it requires somebody to be there. And the development of an irrational, mutual, emotional attachment takes even more occasions, even more time. And if the attachment is to be mutual, it not only takes somebody to be there, it takes the same somebody. That's asking a lot nowadays. As a young woman put it to me in a recent conversation, you've got to be crazy to have kids nowadays. And she's not alone. Some of you may have seen that letter that Ann Landers got, which her mother wrote, said she wished she'd never had her kids. And that upset Miss Landers so much, she put the letter in the column and asked people to write their comments. She got 10,000 letters back, and 70% agreed. Said they, too, wished they never had their kids. Now, of course, that's a biased sample. 7,000 strong. You got to be crazy to have kids nowadays. In my judgment, there is some truth in that statement, although it is not true. It is becoming increasingly difficult to provide children with the conditions necessary for their normal, just normal, psychological development. And this brings us to our third major question. What are the conditions that determine how well children's needs can be met? What do the research data say? Here's what the data say to me. Proposition 4. To develop the enduring involvement of one or more adults in care, activity, etc., requires social policies and practices that provide opportunity, status, encouragement, example, and approval for parenthood. And that's not all. Parenthood, not just on the part of mothers, or even fathers or relatives, or professionals. This is in order of increasing importance. Those are important, but even more important than relatives or professionals or friends or our friends neighbors, work associates. That is, people who do not carry direct responsibility for the care and well-being of children and families. And it's not only on the part of individuals. And here we come to the giant step, the quantum leap. Institutions. Institutions of our society, and I have in mind not those that we ordinarily think of, not just those like educational, health, welfare, sort of things. I'm talking about the other major institutions, state and local government, mass media, the legal system, transportation facilities, means of communication, shopping facilities, working hours, patterns of recreation and social life, the arrangement of residential and business areas. Indeed, we may sum up all these factors under two sort of main headings. These two headings will determine the quality of the next generation in our country. And the first one is neighborhood, and the second one is the world of work, which in the United States of America means companies and corporations. Well, we've come a long way from the cradle to the corporation. But we have arrived at the crux of the problem. For the issue is not who cares for children, but who cares for those who care. Evidence? Some comes from research in our own society, but much more is based on experience, primarily in other countries. Let me give you some examples. A few months ago, I gave a lecture very similar to this one in Stockholm, Sweden. It evoked considerable interest. The next day, there was a front-page article about it in Sweden's biggest morning newspaper, and on the following day, I was invited for a meeting with the Prime Minister of that country, Olof Palme. And he spent more than 2 hours in the late afternoon talking about Swedish policy for families and children, with yours truly, but it had nothing to do with me. What did it have to do with? It had to do with a concern for and a commitment to families and children on the part of the entire society, from its leaders on down. What's the evidence for the commitment? Well, mind you, you might not like what they're committed to, but I don't think one can question the sincerity of that commitment. For example, much of our conversation dealt with two laws that the Prime Minister and his party had introduced in the Swedish Parliament. The first of these laws had passed by a wide margin some time before, and the second had just failed of passage. The law that had passed authorized sick leave for working parents whenever a child was ill, provided that half of the allotted leave time was taken by the father. The law that failed would have permitted parents with a child under 3 to work a 6-hour instead of an 8-hour day, with the remaining 2 hours paid for out of Social Security, again provided that half of the released time was taken by the father. Now, some persons to whom I've mentioned this have said, well, I wouldn't want to live in a country where they make laws about how you should conduct your family life. Well, I can share that view, but I would remind you we live in such a country. We have different laws. We have a law, for example, that you can't get welfare payments if you have a man living in the house. That's a law. Tells you how to live your family life. In this case, not live it. Now, the Prime Minister had been spending the whole day talking with representatives of the groups that had defeated this bill, trying to persuade them to change their position on it. And these groups were of two kinds. First, there were unions, who argued that the passage of a bill establishing a 6-hour day for working parents of young children would destroy any hope for legislating a 6-hour working day for everybody. Therefore, they were against it. Second were certain women's groups who opposed the bill on the ground that it placed responsibility for the care of children on parents, rather than providing for substitute care by professionals or paraprofessionals. In their view, no one should be placed in the position of having to care for children who was not interested, trained, and paid for that kind of work. You see, said the Prime Minister, they do not understand the crucial importance for the child's development of what you call irrational involvement. I replied that nevertheless his society had recognized a problem and was prepared to do something about it. No, he responded, you overestimate our progress. We still have a long way to go. Let me give you an example. He then recounted an incident that had occurred on the previous day. It had been his first evening off in several weeks, and he was just settling down to enjoy it when the doorbell rang. And there stood a worker from the local daycare center with 2 young children and a tale of woe. It seems that the parents had failed to pick up the child at the closing hour, so the worker had taken the children to their home herself, only to find that no one was present except the teenage son and his friends, all of them drunk. What happened then, I asked. Oh, I took my young son with me. He's 18. We got those teenagers out of there. We cleaned up the children. We fed them, and I left my son there to wait till somebody got home. You see, our people still do not understand that when you're dealing with children, you cannot expect to work on a fixed time schedule, says the Prime Minister. As he spoke, a vision came to my mind. There's a knock at the door of a house in Georgetown, and as Mr. Kissinger answers the door, he sees. So much for anecdotal evidence. What about research findings? Some time ago, I completed for the National Academy of Sciences a review of systematic research on the effects of special programs conducted for children and families from disadvantaged backgrounds. Studies covered a variety of projects ranging from group preschool programs in the manner of Head Start, through tutoring efforts, home visits involving both the mother and the child. And some strategies did turn out better than others, but in my judgment, the most important finding concerned certain factors that predicted how successful any program would be, regardless of the method or content involved. And there were 5 conditions that were critical in this regard. First, the employment status of the breadwinner. Job, no job. Second, level of family income. Third, the number of children per room in the household. Fourth, the presence of more than one adult in the home. Fifth, parents' education. When the breadwinner was unemployed, when the family income was below the poverty line, when many children were crowded into a small space and only one parent present without much schooling, no intervention program, no special program, whatever the strategy employed, was able to be very effective. That is, if all these factors were taken together. Conversely, children from families that were not subjected to these stresses simultaneously were more likely to benefit from whatever opportunities were provided. So, we're back where we were at the very outset of our inquiry. Once again, we've discovered that the critical factor is the conditions under which a family lives. And these conditions are often not in the family's power to control. For example, take the problem of finding a job nowadays. Clearly, our national policy on unemployment has implications for what happens to children, to the next generation. We said it's the conditions under which the family lives. It's important to recognize what these conditions mean in concrete terms. As a case in point, we may take the 2.3 million children under 6 whose mother is a single parent and also the family head. What are the economic facts of life for these families? For comparative purposes, let's look first at the situation of all 6-year-olds living in 2-parent families. Based on the latest available data from the United States Census, the median income, that's 50% above, 57% below, for these families was $12,886. But for all of the nation's 6-year-olds whose mothers are single-parent heads of families, the median income in the same year, last year, just under $3,900. That's all of them. An instructive contrast is provided by the median income of single-parent fathers. We now have enough of them, so they appear in the census. Same year, $9,200. Just proves to you how much better a parent, a father, is than the mother. Look at the difference in how much we are willing to pay. Economic deprivation is even more extreme for single-parent mothers under the age of 25 who are family heads. Such a mother, when all her children are small, that is under 6 years of age, must make do with a median income of only $3,021 a year. Yet there are more than 500,000 mothers having to live under these circumstances, and they constitute almost a quarter of all single-parent mothers with children under 6. These, then, are some of the conditions of life for a substantial number of the next generation of Americans. Yet, 2 years ago, I was in a society with much lower levels of family income, much larger families, many more children per room, far lower levels of education, of poorer quality, and much more parental absence, not only on the part of fathers, but mothers as well. We met many broken families, but no broken children. There were 13 of us in all experienced child watchers, and I believe it's fair to say that we had seen some of the most impressive preschoolers we had ever seen in our professional lives. Healthy, competent, resourceful, versatile, charming, helpful, happy, and possessed of whopping self-esteem. We were in the People's Republic of China. I hasten to add that all but 2 of us were illiterate. We didn't know the language, not to mention the history, culture. We didn't even know where we were. But we were experienced in observing children of all ages, including those who were not young enough to talk, and those we could understand about as well as anybody else. We asked ourselves what accounted for the impressive development of these Chinese children, and we came to an unexpected answer. One word: neighborhood. Whether in the city or the countryside, it was the neighborhood that provided the context and support for children and those responsible for their care. Everything was being done for children and families that was being done was being carried on a neighborhood basis. We'd go to interview a family, we'd walk in, we'd be introduced here, the family members and the kids, and there'd be this young man. Who is he? Sitting there drinking tea. Oh, he's the local health worker. He said, I come here almost every day to drink tea. Very good tea here. Of course, he's doing his job. All the children went to school nearby and came home for the midday meal, as did other members of the household. The meal had been prepared by the mother during her noon break from the street factory, only a stone's throw away. This factory's next door on the street. Terribly inefficient. We visited some of those factories. Even we, who are not specialists, knew this is no way to run a railroad. In fact, we felt obligated. We said to our Chinese hosts, we said, now look, it just doesn't make sense to use these little furnaces here. You can't. Mr. Bronfenbrenner, you do not understand. Our purpose is to serve the people. Crazy. In the evening, the whole family gathers at the community house for political indoctrination. In short, all the major aspects of life are carried on at the neighborhood level, and many of these activities are focused around the family and the children. But do not be misled. The world of children and families in the People's Republic of China is hardly one that most of us would choose for ourselves or our children. Parents are often separated for long periods of time, as one or the other is sent to work in a farm or factory in a far-off province, or assigned to one of the many 7th of May cadre schools for periodic political re-education. We met young husbands and wives who had this experience, sometimes volunteering for it when their children were very young, first year of life. Gone for a year in your child's first year of life. And once children themselves finish middle school as teenagers, 80% of them are assigned to work as peasants in the countryside, far away, not infrequently for the rest of their lives. And it's not only a matter of action, it's a matter of thought as well. Your thoughts have to be correct, and if not, you are helped in discovering the true path. No, we didn't see any broken children in China, only broken intellectuals. It is an anti-scientific world, at least with respect to the study of human beings. I recall an occasion when I thought I had a telling argument. We had visited a commune where the peasants were doing experiments on the growth of plants under different soil conditions. And the next day I put a question to our discerning host. Mr. Xie, I said, the peasants yesterday were trying to find out what kind of plants grow best in what kind of soil. Now, why don't you do research on what kinds of conditions are best for what kinds of children? Mr. Xie looked at me with compassion. Mr. Bronfenbrenner, you do not understand. You see, every plant is different from every other plant. It is important to believe that all children are the same. He said it very slowly, realizing how difficult it would be, but nevertheless he thought he'd better make it clear, and went on to explain that if you think one child is more capable than another, you might begin to treat him accordingly, and then, he said, he becomes as different as you thought him. What are the implications of all this for us? Not much. We're not Chinese. The successes of today's communist China and their failures, and the methods used to achieve each, are deeply rooted in the experience of a 5,000-year-old culture, and we're only 200 years old. What works for them will not work for us. And perhaps it's just as well, for our traditions are different. What are our traditions? I was asked this question in China, and it wasn't a comfortable experience. I'd asked a teacher about the goals of child rearing in her country, and her answer ended with a query. In our society, she said, we have a guiding principle. It is to serve the people. What is the guiding principle in your society? It wasn't that I couldn't think of what to say. I just didn't think she'd understand if I said, do your own thing, baby. Let it all hang out. Don't let it hassle you. Do your own thing. And that's what we've been doing. Family breakup is not the cause of broken children. It's an effect. Broken children, broken families are the products of national indifference. And they're not the only victims. It's not just children, it's the old, it's the sick, it's the disenfranchised, it's any group that isn't young, sexy, and making it. By making it, I mean being able to pay your own way. But as we heard from our Soviet specialist, there are some things you can't pay for, and we're not willing to pay for those. What I'm saying is that at this point in our history, we are not a caring society. We want to do our own thing. We are unwilling to make irrational commitments to children, to families, to grandparents, to relatives, even to our wives and husbands. At the wedding ceremony, if there is one, you no longer hear, for richer, for poorer, in sickness or in health, till death do us part. And for good reason. Nowadays, it's a contract. You got your rights, I got my rights. We'll keep track to make sure that neither one does more than his or her share, right? And if you're not getting satisfaction, we can always split. As the television ads tell us, don't bother to fix it. Get a new one. We are unwilling to make irrational commitments, not only in the family, but beyond, to friends, to neighbors, to community, indeed to our country. Remember, don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And since then, we've had Watergate, do your own thing. How come? Why, as we celebrate our second centennial, should we also be celebrating do your own thing? It's not what the founding fathers had in mind. They said, e pluribus unum, one out of many. What happened to the unum? Or are we all just pluribus, everybody for himself? You know, when I describe what other societies are doing, often my fellow countrymen say, well, we couldn't do that. In our country, we have no common goals. We have no shared values. We're all different. Not so. One thing I have learned from cross-cultural research over the past 2 decades that really surprised me, yes, we are different, not from each other, but from every other modern society. We're far out. On what? What are our distinctive values? Well, individualism is certainly one, and we've had it a long time. As we've been reminded this year, it's emblazoned on the colonial flag of Massachusetts. Don't tread on me. Our preoccupation with guns, of course, is another distinctive feature. No other country. We're the only country in the world that allows tens of thousands of men, women, and children to be killed and maimed by armed weapons, often by intent. And what is even more extraordinary, we get national apoplexy at the suggestion that the guns that do the killing should be removed from easy circulation. Our congressmen get 100 times more mail and phone calls when the threat is to the guns in our homes than when the victims are the children who live there. Only in America. But that is not our most important distinctive feature so far as children are concerned. We are unique in three other more destructive ways. First, the United States is now the only modern industrialized nation, the only one, that doesn't ensure health care for every family with young children. Second, the United States is the only modern industrialized nation that does not guarantee a minimum income level for every family with young children. We're the only one now. And third, we are the only modern industrialized nation that has not yet established a nationwide program of child care services for children of working parents. How come? How come we can deliver men in survival systems to the moon, but we can't deliver health care to the neighborhood? If we're so good at material technology, why not social technology as well? Oh, it's much harder to do the second, you say. Nonsense. Up on the moon, we had to figure out how to adapt man to a completely alien environment. Down on Earth, we've had the benefit of millions of years of evolution to adapt our species to survival right here. Shouldn't be too difficult to make it possible for us to thrive in our own natural environment. The problem, of course, is one of priorities. What do we think is more important? But it's also a matter of approach. When we build a physical delivery system like a space vehicle, we proceed systematically. There's a long planning phase followed by pre-testing, first of every separate component, then you put them together into subsystems. Finally, you pre-test the system as a whole. You try it out with nobody in it to make sure nobody will get hurt. And at each stage, if there's a bug, we have a famous American term. Send it back to the drawing board. We expect it. We know that's the only way to make things work. That's Yankee ingenuity, or as historians and social critics since de Tocqueville have referred to it, American pragmatism. That, too, is as American as apple pie. But when we plan social programs, we don't do any of that. We make a rough sketch, and then we start it going. There's no small-scale pre-testing of components or no field trials. We don't even look to see if the pieces fit. We just launch the whole thing and watch it fall apart and maim human beings in the process, especially women and children. Our welfare system is a case in point. If one set about deliberately to design a system that couldn't work and would mutilate people in the process, we could hardly have thought out a more effective machine. Why do we succeed so brilliantly in one sphere and fail so spectacularly in another? Now, that's a difficult question, but looking at it from a cross-cultural perspective has made me aware of a paradox in our national outlook, a kind of split philosophy, perhaps even a conflict in our religious beliefs. As pragmatists, we say and we believe that every problem has a solution. We can fix anything, no matter how complicated. If existing techniques don't work, we'll invent new ones and get the job done. We can make the H-bomb, we can get the moon, the Mars. We have that lovely American slogan, the difficult we do today, the impossible takes a little longer. But when it comes to human beings, a different principle comes into play. You can't change human nature, we say. People are good, or they're evil, they're weak, or they're strong. You can't do very much about it. In fact, you shouldn't even try. It might weaken their moral fiber. It's a strange, uniquely American form of the Protestant ethic that pervades all segments of our society across religious and ethnic lines. It's what unites us. The underlying credo reflects another sterner facet of our individualism. Each person, we say, is responsible for himself. If he succeeds, it's to his credit. If he fails, it's his own fault. He's only getting what he deserved. Helping him won't work. He shouldn't be coddled. He has to learn to try harder, to stand on his own feet. In fact, we have the great American ideal, the self-made man. But there is no such person. If we stand on our own 2 feet, it is because others have raised us up. If as adults we can lay claim to competence and compassion, it only means that someone else was willing and enabled to commit their competence and their compassion to us as children. What my discipline teaches is that there is no other way. It is important to believe, not that all children are the same, for they're not, but that every human being has the potential to become a person who can contribute to the lives of others and to the community in which he lives. And if he doesn't, it's because he is prevented by existing circumstances. And if these circumstances are changed, the human potential can be fulfilled. And we don't really believe that. How can we change our beliefs? In the good old American way, by being pragmatic. Try it. You'll like it. Where to begin? Right here at home, in your own community. As pragmatists, the first thing you should do is find out the facts. You can do this by conducting a community audit of what's happening to the children in your town and those who care for them, and to the old and to the sick and to the handicapped, people living alone, and perhaps even more important, what is happening to their caretakers, to parents, to teachers, to friends, to neighbors, all the others who care for us when we need it, and we all do, or could care for us if arrangements were different. Now, this audit should not be conducted only by those who care for people, not just by the social agencies, the school, and so on, but by all the segments of the community should be involved, the businessmen, the professionals, the mass media, the skilled workers, the unions, the retired people, everybody. Remember, it's not just who cares for children, it's who cares for those who care. Don't forget the children themselves. They can help in interviewing house to house. They're great charmers. And when you get the results, have them reported in the local newspapers, the TV channels, and the radio stations. What you will discover are lots of problems. But being American pragmatists, you will also think of solutions. Some will require action at the national level, but most will not, for we're a pluralistic society that recognizes the necessity and strength of local initiatives matched to local needs. What will these problems and solutions turn out to be? That I can't tell you. I'm a researcher, not a prophet, but I can anticipate 5 general areas in which families today are likely to experience severe stress, and these are then, of course, the areas also for action. First, there's basic health care for both children and those who care for them. Then there's the need for employment and a minimum family income. And then there's what I've called family support systems, substitute care, home visiting. For example, in Britain, they have a system when if everything's going to pieces and your mother-in-law's sick and you have to go to work, nobody take her, there's a number you can call. And somebody comes, a home visitor, who will take care of things in an emergency. Information about where you go when you're, even if you know when something happens and you're worried, you don't think about where to get the information. It's very useful to have someone to say, here's the information, here's where to get it. Ombudsman, advocacy functions, someone who will be on your side with vis-a-vis the bureaucracy, who will help you find out and then state your case and help you get where you need to get and help them give you what you deserve in terms of help in a situation. Next, problems in the world of work. The need for flexible job schedules. Sick leave for working parents when children are ill. Part-time employment without penalties, what I've called Fair Part-Time Employment Practices Act, so that you don't have to suffer fringe benefits and seniority and pay just because you want to work part-time. And finally, perhaps most important of all, rebuilding and building neighborhoods in the service of families. So you get exchange and cooperation, you get ties between the home and the school, you build bridges between the school and the world of work, which is where the children have to go if they graduate. Give teachers support instead of criticism. Give parents support instead of criticism. involving children in meeting community needs. I've talked about having a curriculum for caring, which starts in the elementary grades, in which kids contribute to caring for people, not just learn about it, but do it. Old people, older children helping younger children, sick people who can be visited, places that can be fixed up. Developing family impact statements on the possible effects of decisions on the lives of families, both in the private sector and the public sector. Now, if we act on these problems, the awesome trends I described at the outset may take a turnaround. When families become as important to America as football or firearms, perhaps the divorce rate will take a plunge. Non-readers cease to be our major national problem, and juvenile delinquency will experience the dropouts, and neighborhoods will once again become a place for people to live together. But what about doing your own thing? Doesn't that conflict with the course of action I'm proposing? Yes, it does. But it is not our only value as Americans. We have other beliefs in our tradition, beliefs that speak to unum, not just pluribus, to the welfare of others, not just self-gratification, to concern not just for me, but for our children. Who said we stand for these things? We did. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, capitalized, establish justice, uppercase, ensure domestic tranquility, capitalized, provide for the common defense, small letters. Our founding fathers knew the difference between means and ends. Promote the general welfare, capitalized, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Thank you very much.